brevemente de usted.
Ajá.
¿Qué tal? Muy buenos días a todos. Tengo el honor de presentar al doctor Miguel Vargas Martín, que el día de hoy nos va a estar dando la conferencia magistral, la inteligencia artificial como facilitadora de tecnologías y educación inclusivas. Me permito dar una breve semblanza de su currículum. El doctor Miguel Vargas Martín es doctor por la Universidad de Carleton, Canadá, y profesor investigador de la Universidad Tecnológica de Ontario, también en Canadá. Su investigación se centra principalmente en los paradigmas de autenticación por computadora y el uso de fenómenos de la mente humana a través de interfaces cerebro-computadora, así como en técnicas probadas en el campo de la psicología. Durante la última década lo ha convertido en un científico de datos que utiliza el método científico en combinación con algoritmos de aprendizaje automático y técnicas de ingeniería de funciones compatibles con Python. Actualmente está explorando la inteligencia artificial para robots compañeros, aprovechando su experiencia en aprendizaje profundo de máquina y su experiencia con los fenómenos de la mente humana. Las áreas inactivas que perdieron tracción por varias razones incluyen la estenografía de red en forma de canales ocultos de Wi-Fi, sistemas de aprendizaje en línea adaptativos y la lucha contra la explotación infantil en Internet. Bien, doctor, en nombre del comité organizador, le damos la más cordial bienvenida y tiene usted el uso de la palabra. Adelante.
Muchas gracias, doctor Rojano. Una pregunta, ¿la conferencia la puedo dar en inglés o en español? ¿Cuál es la preferencia?
Como usted prefiera, doctor.
Bueno, la verdad es que me quedan los términos mejor en inglés. Entonces, ¿la damos en inglés?
Sí, sin problema, adelante.
Ok, bueno. Bueno, it is my pleasure to give this presentation at the CONTIE conference. I'm a professor at Ontario Tech University. And so I'm hoping that this presentation is going to give you a good historical reference and provide some contrast between the technological advancements for teaching and learning technologies, and at the same time, the evolution of inclusive education, and all within the context of AI. To do this, first I'm going to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion in the province of Ontario, where my university is. And, um, and then I will talk about misconceptions and barriers that hinder the development of inclusive education. I will continue with some points about how artificial intelligence can enable educational environments that are inclusive, and then I finalize with the mention of another project that I'm working on. So, okay, so just to give you a quick information about my university. I've been there since 2004, and I have seen this university grow across the years. The university started operation in 2003, and now we have thousands of students with undergraduate and graduate programs, and we have more than 80 specialized research labs and facilities. So what is the motivation for this talk? First of all is equity, diversity, and inclusiveness policies and procedures need to be addressed in educational systems across the world. So we need to be able to offer learning opportunities that allow individuals to reach their full potential. Now, in terms of societies, how they evolve, one thing is to acknowledge the existence of diversity traits in human beings, and another thing is to build the policies that support that diversity, and also build the legislation that also support the promotion of these policies in different organizations. The number three motivator is that the level of specialization required is more and more demanding and more and higher every time. So, for example, the occupation of computer programmers should continue to afford visually impaired people with a range of job opportunities. And this is not happening. There are some specializations that are highly dependent on certain abilities. So we need to focus on those and see how we can give equal opportunity to everybody. The fourth point is about uh, the technological learning platforms, how they have become the norm these days. And this is especially for the COVID time. You know, when COVID hit early 2020, many educational institutions move into virtual learning. So and remain like that for at least a year. So if we have had the capability of collecting information as to how users use the learning platforms online, we would have now a very rich data set that we could feed into an AI system to learn things about students. So did we take full advantage of that? Are we taking full advantage of that? Now we are in the kind of like a post-pandemic stage, we hope. And so it's not too late uh, to get to work and collect important data that we can use to train AI systems. And the last point is artificial intelligence. It offers a rich spectrum of possibilities to enable inclusive education. But first, we need to define precisely what inclusive education is and what diversity is. So, without further ado, I'd like to talk about the education delivery across time and see where we are in the map of time and how things have evolved and when things actually started with inclusive education. So everything started um, for distance education or online education or the use of uh, additional techniques for education. We can date it back to the time when there was correspondence learning. You know, students will learn by correspondence. Then in around early 1900, there was the telecommunication, the transatlantic telecommunication, and then the radio and the TV came up. But it wasn't until around the 1930 when radio was used as a learning distance education. And then we had in the 1950s, that's when TVs started to proliferate and many households started to buy TVs. So that was an opportunity to teach people as well. And it wasn't until 1983. I mean, who doesn't know Bob Rose and who hasn't seen some of his videos? So he was one of the most important icons for distance education for painting over TV. And it wasn't until early 2000s when we got the EDX platform, the Coursera, the iTunes University, and so many others online teaching education, online teaching that came up. But it wasn't. There has been special education has been considered from as early as 1920, but the research on inclusive education didn't actually start until around 1970 and 1980. So this is a very new area. Um, and then the legislation didn't evolve until the 2009, 2008 with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And Ontario, they adopted their first policies within the province in 2009. So this is brand new. And then, of course, COVID hit the world in the year 2020. And we weren't ready, I don't think, as worldwide, we were not ready to offer virtual education that worked for everybody. So that takes us to the present days when policy development is a big thing, and we need to keep up with those policies so technology can enable the implementation of the policies. Okay, so let's talk about what equity, diversity, and inclusiveness is in the Ontario's educational system. And again, so this was first published in year 2009 when Ontario came up with the equity and inclusive education strategy. So what is it and what definitions they include? It was first launched in 2009, and it aims to help educators across the province to better identify and remove discrimination um, 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 and systematic barriers to support the achievement of well-being of all students. So this is based on the definition of diversity. So, but what is diversity? I mean, it could be expressed in as barriers, or it could be expressed as different qualities and attributes in people. So diversity, um, if you see the definition of diversity, it it provides a non-exhaustive list of what diversity really is. So they say it includes, but is not limited to, ancestry, culture, ethnicity, gender identity, language, and so on and so forth. So there is a lack of precision into what diversity is. And here is where I think artificial intelligence can really help with the definition of diversity um, for a particular demographics. So, and then we go into the definition of equity. And for equity, um, I think the definition itself is mentioning something as to what equity is not. So, that's why is that? Because there is a very common misconception about mixing up equity with equality. So we'll talk about that in just a sec. And then we have the definition of inclusive education, which depends on the definition of diversity, right? So and of course inclusive. But then you see these definitions kind of link to each other. So equity uses definition of diversity, and then inclusive education uses definition of inclusive and definition of diversity. So there is a cycle around these definitions. But the thing that where we are not certain about these definitions is the non-exhaustive list of dimensions of human traits. It's a work in progress and is never going to end because we continue to evolve and to discover new barriers. So keeping those in mind, and still within the context of Ontario, um, this diagram, which is equity and inclusive education strategy, the guiding principles and areas of focus. This was taken from the document that I mentioned earlier, and you see that there is 8 different areas of focus, and also their connection with the Ontario Human Rights Code. And then we have in the middle we have the equity and inclusive education, and these type of diagrams help a lot in the understanding of what inclusive education is and how it can be used to generate the policy within educational institutions. And the next diagram, along the same lines, it is providing guidance as to how to connect the inclusive education, different areas of inclusive education with government resources. This is very important as well. Writing policy in a university about inclusive education is one thing, but if we don't have the supporting bodies from the government, then it's going to be very hard to implement these things. Okay, so let's talk about misconceptions of inclusive education. And also, before we talk about those misconceptions, let's not forget that there is other barriers beside misconceptions, like, for example, the stereotyping. Uh, the stereotyping may lead to teachers being reluctant to adopt any inclusive education measure in their courses. And so unfortunately, some teachers or some professors may think, why should I change the way I deliver a course? Because there is only a minority that need a different mode of delivery. I should focus on the majority who are expecting this material to be delivered. Well, that is mostly based on stereotyping and also lack of training on the teacher or the instructor. So inadequate training is a big barrier that we have to overcome. Of course, there is also funding. Having these policies and implementing these policies in a university or in a school is not, it doesn't come for free. It does require resources. So, finding the appropriate funding for to implement these policies is important. Okay, so but let's focus on the misconceptions. Keeping in mind that there is other barriers, I like to focus on the misconceptions. So there is misconceptions on diversity. For so what some people may call differences, I think we should change our mindset and start calling them complementary strengths. Of course, this diversity is not fixed. Is not fixed uh, in a geographical location, and is not fixed in time. It keeps evolving and it keeps changing. Even for a particular individual, the diversity may change across time and as they move around different geographical locations. So one important thing here of a misconception is that the diversity happens between groups. Um, I think there is more diversity happening within groups than between groups. So how we treat these groups is extremely important. And how artificial intelligence can help here is by identifying these differences between groups, not, sorry, within groups, not between groups. Another misconception it's in terms of equity, and this image uh, has become iconic to illustrate the difference between equality and equity. And I think the picture gives us a very good idea of the difference. But I like to address here one thing that keeps coming up, and I keep seeing this over and over, especially for the cabinets of governments. They sometimes brag that they have a 50-50 representation, 50 for men and women, and it's like something we should be happy about. Well, we have to be very careful with those because obviously the population is normally split into a 50-50. So what you expect is that for any given position, the number of applications should be split 50-50, right? But it doesn't mean that somebody is going to be hired just for the fact of being a woman, okay? So in fact, if hirings are based on that, we're probably setting up somebody for failure, because if they don't have the actual merits that are required for the job, they will find themselves in a tough situation, right? So we have to be very careful with these quotas. Of course, our world is based on numbers and statistics, but we don't have to just try to please those numbers and statistics. We have to be very careful with that. So it is by far more important to provide all groups, women and men, with equal opportunities so that they can exploit their potential to the maximum degree. Okay. So another misconception happens with inclusive technology within the realm, within the context of inclusive education. So thinking that technology alone will solve all our problems, we might be wrong about that, because obviously you need an ecosystem around this technology. So artificial intelligence by itself is not enough. Another misconception is that technology alone won't solve all our problems. If we have a very well-trained instructor, but this instructor doesn't have the means to fully exploit his or her potential as a teacher, then things are not going to work either. So we need a balance between all these different elements so AI can help indeed with inclusive education. So just to give you an idea, I don't know if you're familiar with the Delphi project. It's called the Ask Delphi project. So it's kind of an oracle online that you can type in your question, and it's going to give you a descriptive. It's a computational model for descriptive ethics. So you write down your question, and then it tells you whether it's right or wrong. It's kind of like a yes or no answer you're going to get. And this is just to illustrate that AI by itself is not sufficient. We need more. For example, when I ask, is COVID a good thing? It responds that it is discretionary, right? And then it has some contradictions. For example, you can ask, is it okay to give more time to answer a quiz to a student with a learning disability? And it says it's good. Fine, and we agree with that. If that is part of the learning disability accommodation requirements, it's good. But then if you ask, is it unfair that all students in a class get the same time to answer a quiz regardless of diversity? And then you get a response, no, it is fair. So it's like saying, no, forget about diversity. Give everybody the same time. Okay. And so on and so forth. So this is just to give an example of the capabilities of AI and the current state of the technology. Okay, so, and then we have more misconceptions. These ones are related to inclusive education. And as we mentioned before, so there is a cycle between these three definitions. They need each other. If there is something broken in the diversity definition, or because it's given a non-exhaustive list of diversity traits, then the other two are going to be missing that part. And I think that's where AI can help. And unfortunately, if the diversity is not properly defined, that's going to carry over to equity and, of course, to inclusive education. So any misconception on diversity will be carried over to inclusive education. We want to mitigate or limit or eliminate these misconceptions. Okay, so how can AI contribute to inclusive education environments? So we have to see AI not as a silver bullet that is going to solve all the problems. We have to see it as a tool that will help us enable inclusive education, a part of a full ecosystem. And that ecosystem has many components. AI would be one of those. So what are the efforts that myself have been conducting to use AI for inclusive education? So let me talk about one of those. And so we have an LMS, or a learning management system, where all students take this LMS, use this LMS for learning, and then they are supposed to meet a set of learning outcomes. So this is pretty much a typical scenario that we have. And now during COVID, this was the typical scenario that prevailed in most environments. So regardless of the needs of particular individuals, they are all presented with the same LMS, the same material, and they are all supposed to meet the same set of learning outcomes. So what we did, and we did this on real classroom with real students at Ontario Tech. So we said, okay, let's have an adaptive LMS that presents material in different ways to people. Okay, so but how do we achieve this? Well, with AI. So we encapsulated the system into something we call IP SIMs. And IP SIMs is it has an AI that is monitoring all the actions and all the choices of students as they navigate within the LMS. So it requires student profiles, self-declared profiles, and that allow us to find this diversity that we're talking about. So what is the granularity of the diversity? And what is the differences within groups or between groups that we should take into account to present the learning material in the best possible way to each student needs? So this AI is looking also at the learning outcomes and is figuring out, oh, okay, so these students with these characteristics took these paths in the LMS and they did very well. So the AI is constantly learning this and is modifying the LMS for each particular individual. It's a customized learning management system. So we tested this system in 2 actual classes at Ontario Tech. And so what we asked them to provide us information as to try to find this granularity of diversity or all these traits. We did, of course, we could have gone with the definition of that Ontario has for diversity and as for ancestry, culture, ethnicity, gender, and so on and so forth. We decided to do this in a different way. So we did include some of those variables, but we also include habits. So how many hours per week they are surfing the web, how many hours per week they play video games. We felt that that was important because that kind of give us an idea of the literacy they have or this how skilled they are with computers and using online systems. So we also asked them about the learning expectations that they have for the course. I mean, that is also important. Why not taking it into consideration? So we took all these variables, blend them into the AI, and then the AI is also at the same time looking at the different paths they take within the learning management system, like this. So we presented students with 6 case studies that they had to choose from to achieve certain learning outcome. So they choose amongst these case studies. We had some actors and we recorded scenarios that kind of mimic the scenario they will encounter in a real environment. And so once the students choose these scenarios, then they have different options to navigate within the learning management system. So they can, if you're a visual learner, you can go for the videos. There is videos here you can see and observe what's going on. And then the goal is that everyone, regardless of whether they choose the video or the written case study, or maybe is something related to hands-on to some degree, as much as you can in a virtual environment, or perhaps just auditory. Some people are more auditory than visual. So we offer all these different options. And then at the end, the AI system, which is looking at everyone's movements in the LMS, will figure out, based on the variables that you gave me at the beginning, like those variables, and your navigation through the learning management system, and also based on the partial marks that you have obtained in the midterm, in the middle of the term, it looks like these are the best paths that you can follow, and then it does that in a customized way for each of the students of the class. So what else can we infer once users are using the system? So of course, we find out what diversity is within groups, but we can also make predictions at early stages. So we can go and say to a particular student and say, it looks like you are in the right path to obtain a very good grade in this course. Or the opposite, you can say, it looks to me that even though you're reading all the documents, you're answering all the quizzes, I don't think this is the right path for you. I think you should focus on these particular videos that people within your diversity group used, and they are succeeding in the course. So you can make this type of predictions. And of course, you can find optimal learning paths that work best for groups that you identify. Okay, so just to close with some other projects. Um, so I like to point out that the gap between policy and actual level of inclusive education is still very significant. And so there are many research lines that deserve full exploration by researchers. And as I mentioned at the beginning, when I show you the historical description of how inclusive education, when it came up, so we're talking about not even 2 decades, less than 2 decades since policy, at least in Ontario, started to take place uh, provincial wide. So so there are many things that could be explored. And what I've been talking about today um, uh, in the second part of the presentation was an AI-enabled LMS for generic groups, and I presented the IP SIMS, which is subject matter oriented. As you could tell, it was oriented towards health science education. So it was all health science students that were accessing these IP SIMS. But on the other side of things, there is also specialized contents for a target group. And here I'm working with the CNIB, and the so that is a target for visually impaired. So we are developing a group of scientists, including myself. We are developing an AI-enabled programming course for visually impaired. So this requires there is many pieces that we have to put together. So we need an accessible LMS. As you know, programming is a highly visual skill. So the bar is actually pretty high for us to come up with a course or a methodology to teach visually impaired students how to program a computer. So we need an accessible LMS. We need also accessible test centers. Um, this course is going to be offered on site. It's not virtual, so it's offered actually at the university. But we're going to have to, at some point, when they go back to their homes, they may have to write a test. So we need accessible test centers across the province. And also we need trained instructors to teach the visually impaired. If you take the average instructor for a programming course, it will be very hard for them to fully understand the needs and the methodologies that they need to implement to teach the visually impaired. So with these ideas, I close my presentation. I will thank you all for your attention, and I will take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Doctor Miguel. Si tenemos alguna pregunta, por favor, para el doctor, permítame revisar. Estamos esperando un momentito, doctor. Si hay alguna pregunta en el Facebook
Sí,
o
claro.
aquí en el chat. Doctor, una pregunta.
Sí,
Con respecto al programa que menciona para la enseñanza de las personas con discapacidad visual,
sí.
en este caso es un proyecto como una licenciatura, un programa o es formado.
No, es un proyecto conjunto que de hecho estamos planeando con el doctor Jesús Sandoval. Y un grupo de investigadores también en la Ontario Tech y en el Canadian National Institute for the Blind. Y conseguimos financiamiento para desarrollar un curso donde va a ser un curso que se ofrece durante el verano y los estudiantes vienen de todo el país a tomar el curso, todos los que estén interesados. Entonces es una estancia en el verano, el curso se estima que va a durar un par de semanas y entonces ofrecemos todo el sistema integral desde eh, el alojamiento en la ciudad hasta las clases y aparte un tutor especializado por cada estudiante que se especializa en estudiantes con imparidad visual.
Fantástico. En lo que nos presenta como digamos, esta necesidad de tener un LMS, un sistema de administración de conocimiento, pues que sea accesible. Digamos, se han realizado pruebas con los actuales sistemas, se ha encontrado que no son totalmente accesibles y en este caso están ustedes programando uno nuevo.
Sí, gracias por la pregunta. Eh, no nos metimos a utilizar lo que es en aquel entonces, en la universidad usábamos el Blackboard, pero también había profesores que usaban el Moodle y algunos otros, pero, pero no son accesibles en principio. Entonces lo que hicimos fue crear nuestro propio sistema. Ahora, eh, lo que quisimos hacer ahí no era, no incluimos la parte para los con límites visuales, con capacidades visuales diferentes. Era más bien enfocarnos en las variables que habíamos establecido en el principio, que se enfocaban al estatus socioeconómico, al nivel de, de confort que tenían con los sistemas en línea, pero no nos enfocamos a la parte de visual.
Fantástico. El doctor Francisco Álvarez lo felicita, le manda un saludo afectuoso y también le pregunta si hay un plan para trabajar en otras discapacidades a futuro.
Sí, gracias por la pregunta, doctor Álvarez, y un saludo también. Eh, Otros temas, sí, estamos abiertos a trabajar en LMS que sean incluyentes y que sean accesibles, pero hay mucho trabajo que hacer. Por lo general, lo que falta es el financiamiento y falta el tiempo para echar manos a la obra. Pero sí, estamos abiertos a cualquier tipo de colaboración.
Ok, pues en lo particular me parece un proyecto fantástico, doctor. Perdón, aquí tengo otra pregunta. Eduardo Rodríguez, buenos días, para felicitar al doctor y preguntar, ¿las demás provincias, perdón, siguen un plan parecido a Ontario en materia de inclusividad y educación?
Sí, muy buena pregunta, gracias. Sí, cada provincia se maneja independientemente en este ámbito, pero eh, la legislación es provincial, pero la expectativa a nivel federal es que todas implementen algún tipo de política al respecto.
Ok. Andrea Margarita de Anda pregunta, muy interesante presentación, ¿qué algoritmos de IA se usaron en el proyecto de IP Sims?
Sí, gracias por la pregunta, muy bien. Utilizamos diferentes algoritmos. Esto se utilizó ya como por el año 2011, 2010 más o menos. Y en aquel entonces utilizamos support vector machines o máquinas de vectores de soporte. Utilizamos eh, algunas otras técnicas de aprendizaje de máquina convencionales. Me parece que utilizamos también la de, para formar grupos utilizamos la de K-means, y algunas otras, pero fueron convencionales y algún tipo de red neuronal, pero no muy profunda.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Aquí tenemos otra pregunta del doctor Andrés Sandoval que nos dice si durante la pandemia la institución brindó apoyo a estudiantes con necesidades especiales. Si fue así, ¿qué tipo de ayuda?
Sí, desafortunadamente, bueno, yo no tengo conocimiento de que lo hayan hecho. Por lo general, desafortunadamente, es como el esquema que tengo aquí en la pantalla, se utiliza el de arriba, ¿no? Que es un Learning Management System y todos se lanzan ahí al ruedo y a ver cómo le hace cada quien. Es desafortunado, pero más bien así fue como sucedió.
Muy bien, perdón, aquí tenemos otra pregunta. En la introducción a su presentación mencionaron que también está trabajando con asistentes personales. ¿Nos podría hablar un poco de ello?
Asistentes personales, ¿dónde sería esa parte? No la... Oh, sí, ya sé a qué se refiere. Sí, en la parte del curso para gente con capacidades distintas visuales, ¿no?
Ujú.
Sí, ahí esa parte requerimos, estos estudiantes necesitan un tutor que esté con ellos, ayudándolos desde el alojamiento, cómo moverse en la ciudad, porque es una ciudad nueva que no conocen, y hasta la parte del curso, ¿no? O sea, se requiere un nivel de especialización bastante alto, porque no solamente deben estar familiarizados con la, la parte logística, pero también con la parte técnica, porque también son tutores que les ayudan a desarrollarse en el curso de programación.
Ok. Em, Muy bien, doctor. Me parece que ya no hay alguna otra pregunta, solamente felicitaciones y agradecimientos para usted. Igualmente, una gran felicitación a su proyecto. Es muy, muy interesante y creo que vale la pena darle seguimiento y estar pendiente de los resultados y que pueda servir también para otras instituciones, ya que hoy en día, pues, todos nos tuvimos que mover a la parte virtual y efectivamente tenemos digamos, una gran problemática con la equidad, como usted nos dice, ¿no? La accesibilidad, la inclusión. Entonces, me parece un fantástico proyecto. Enhorabuena. Muchas felicidades, doctor. Y pues me parece que si no hay otra pregunta, vamos a poder hacer entrega de su constancia virtual y la leo como dice a continuación. For International Conference of Inclusive Technology and Education, present this certificate to Dr. Miguel Vargas Martin for their outstanding participation in the keynote entitled Artificial Intelligence as an Enabler of Inclusive Technology and Education, and it is signed by Dr. Andrés Sandoval Bringas, General Chair of CONTIE 2020, 2021. Doctor, muchísimas gracias y pues una gran felicitación para usted.
Muchas gracias, doctor, y gracias a la universidad también por la invitación. Y fue un placer estar aquí con ustedes.
Muchas gracias. Les devolvemos la voz para que nos indiquen qué es lo que procede en las siguientes sesiones.
Arrancamos con el primer panel de discusión. Por favor, no se nos vayan, nada más vayan por un cafecito y nos vemos en unos minutos más para continuar con las actividades de este día de CONTIE 2021. Muchas gracias, doctor Rojano, muchas gracias, doctor Miguel Vargas, y nos vemos en unos minutos más. Un abrazo.
Gracias. Gracias.
Gracias.